Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us in our session on the National Academies. So before we start, we're just going to go over a couple of Zoom reminders for you guys. We can go to the next slide. So if you experience any Zoom technical issues throughout the session, please call 1-888-799-9666 and choose option 2. Your audio will be streamed through your speakers. Please submit any questions you have throughout the session in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will have someone monitoring that. And this recording, the slides, and the session summaries will be posted on our website, thefdp.org, after the meeting. So now I'm going to pass it off to Michelle, the FDP Coacher.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see all of you in the session, and it's my pleasure to be able to kick us off. We're really pleased to be able to provide an overview of the National Academies and its connection to the Federal Demonstration Partnership. I'm sure you realize that the FDP is an activity of GWIR, the Government University Industry Research Roundtable of the National Academies. And our idea behind this session is to help get our membership more acquainted with the ties to the academies and how the academies itself is organized. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Tom Arison, who will introduce our panelists. Tom is a senior staff member with the Policy and Global Affairs Division of the National Academies. Importantly for the FDP, he has really been so generous in his time and support of the FDP since the recent retirement of Susan Sloan, who was the longtime director of GWIR and a real champion for the FDP at the National Academies. We couldn't be happier that Tom has agreed to step in and help us remain connected and help facilitate so many of the business and program operations that happen between the FDP, GWIR, and the academies. So I just want to make that very important show of thanks to Tom, and I hope you all will do the same in your own ways when you have the opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tom.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. And I'm Tom Arison with the National Academies, as Michelle mentioned, and I'm playing my main job currently is I'm director of the Board on Research Data and Information in Policy and Global Affairs Division. And as Michelle noted, I'm currently, with Susan Sloan's recent retirement, I'm kind of filling in as in a liaison role between the FDP and GWIR and the academies. In today's session, I'm just going to introduce the two speakers and run the slides. And the two speakers are John Hildebrand from University of Arizona, who is an NAS member and the International Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences, and long involved with FDP. And the other speaker is Greg Sims, who is the Chief Program Officer at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And so he oversees all the program activities here, which include our studies, fellowships, roundtables, and other networking activities. And so I will now turn it over, and they're going to explain the academies and their relationship with FDP. So I'll turn it over, I guess, first to John.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a really great pleasure for me to be playing one of my favorite roles here, the sort of one of the bridge people between FDP and the National Academies, and to be working with two great colleagues, Tom and Greg. I'm thinking of my little part of this as a kind of warm up for Greg. I want to put the important information Greg is going to share with everybody in context. So, Tom, could you go to the next slide, please? So I want to say a word about the origins of the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences was established in 1863 at a particularly bad time in the history of the then young country, when it became clear to the leadership of the country that there was a need for science and technology as advice to the government, particularly with respect to prosecuting the Civil War. Senator Henry Wilson from Massachusetts seemed to understand especially well the importance of science and technology, and he I think is very largely responsible for suggesting the idea that the country should have a National Academy of Sciences. This is by no means a novelty at that time. Italy, France, Germany, what is now the United Kingdom, England at that time, they had academies for 200 years already or so by that time. But the United States was just really getting started. It wasn't even 100 years old at the time. And fortunately, the idea of a National Academy of Sciences to advise the nation resonated well with then President Lincoln. It's one of the many great things about President Lincoln. I think that although he wasn't a scientist, he deeply understood the importance of science, of objective information and advice for the nation. So the congressional act that established the Academy and was signed by President Lincoln made an academy which, as you see the wording at the bottom here, the part of the act is quoted. The Academy shall, whenever called upon by any department of the government, investigate, examine, experiment, or report upon any subject of science or art. Now, in those days, art meant basically engineering or technology. The actual expense of such investigations, examinations, experiments, and reports should be paid from appropriations which may be made for the purpose, but the Academy shall receive no compensation whatsoever for any services to the government of the United States. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I've just tried to interpret that 19th century language here. The Congressional Act established a private organization independent of the government and with no government subsidy. And to this day, it's one of the very few academies that are not bought and paid for by the government. This is extremely important for our fulfillment of our charge to be the advisors of the nation for science and technology, as I'll try to stress. Another important point in this sort of translation here is what I've said already. I think our mandate is to provide objective, evidence-based reports to advise policymakers. This is independent of any political bias, any religious bias, any financial bias. It's a very big responsibility. And as that language said, the work is meant to be financed by purpose-specific government appropriations and grants. And today, in addition, by private philanthropy and foundations and other sources. Next slide, please, Tom. So this is really important to me to stress, to clarify, that the aspirations underlying the establishment of the National Academy of Sciences were not exactly what people think. Most people, including members, think about the third bullet there, that this is a great honorific, and they put it on their CV, and that's the end of that. Relatively few members and very few people outside the Academy understand that that was only the third out of three motivations. The first, I've already stressed, to provide independent, objective, evidence-based advice to the nation on matters of science related to science and technology. Second, to elevate the level of science, technology, and innovation in this country when it was a young country. This was with an eye toward those countries I mentioned already, France, England, Germany, Britain, which somehow set a standard for science and technology that at least some people in the United States were starting to aspire to. And finally, it became clear after a few years that science policy advice and science diplomacy were going to be very big endeavors of this initially small Academy of Sciences. Next slide, please. Well, just a word about what the Academy is today. Most of this derives from the original constitution of the Academy, although it's been modified multiple times in the intervening 159 years. There are about 2,500 regular or domestic members. These are citizens of the United States. About 500 international members, used to be called foreign associates, but we changed that a couple of years ago, and I think it's now a 21st century term. And these come from about a third of the countries in the world, not even a third. So we have a lot of work to do to broaden our international representation, but we're working on that. All of these members are elected by the membership, and people can't apply to be members. They're organized into 6 disciplinary classes, pretty logical to all of the people in this call. I think physical and mathematical sciences and biological sciences are the biggest and oldest of the classes. Engineering and applied sciences, of course, is really apropos of the original goal for the Academy. Biomedical sciences here emphasizes research as opposed to delivery of clinical services. And behavioral and social sciences includes fields like sociology, economics, anthropology, and so forth. And finally, the youngest of the classes, developed only, I think, 15 years ago or so, is applied biological agriculture, environmental sciences. That includes ecology, urban ecology, and various other fields that had no logical home in the previous organization. But again, getting to application of science very much in the interest of the country's needs. The leadership of the Academy comprises 5 elected officers: the President, Vice President, Home Secretary, International Secretary, and Treasurer. The Home Secretary deals with all matters having to do with membership and awards and things like that. The International Secretary, that is my role, does what that title suggests. I deal with the rest of the world, and I won't go into details unless I get questions. The Treasurer, of course, basically does what the Controller tells him to do. The Treasurer is a member who oversees the financial business of the Academy, but doesn't actually have to do the business. That's done by professionals. And then there are 12 elected counselors, elected in a manner that ensures that at all times, all 6 classes are represented on the council. So we have 17 members of what is essentially the governing board of the Academy. And this is a very active council that deals with every conceivable issue. We meet 5 times a year, and we have virtual meetings of the executive committee of the council and so forth. So this is really the leadership. We currently have our first first woman president, Marcia McNutt, who is just a brilliant colleague and a wonderful leader. The vice president is also a woman. That's Diane Griffin, a medical scientist. The Home Secretary, Sue Wessler, is also a woman. This is unprecedented in the history of the Academy. For the last several years, a majority of the council has been women. And I have to tell you that the transactions, the deliberations have gone up in quality very significantly as the number of women on the council has increased. No surprise there. Finally, just a word that, of course, of the many things the National Academy of Sciences does, we publish now 2 important journals: the long-established Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and very recently a newly invented open access journal called PNAS Nexus. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, to fulfill the mandate to provide expert, objective advice to the nation, that became a big job within just a few years after the establishment of the Academy. And by the Wilson administration in the early 20th century, it was just too big for the small membership of the Academy at that time to handle all the work. And so a new entity was established, which was a kind of working arm of the National Academy of Sciences to do that advisory work, to do the studies that result in advice for policymakers. And that entity, established in 1916, was called the National Research Council, or to all of us who know it and love it, the NRC. And it was the NRC for many years. So he changed its name, as I will say in a moment. Then in 1964, 101 years after the establishment of the National Academy of Sciences, under the same charter, a new academy was established, a sister academy, the National Academy of Engineering. I think reflecting the importance of engineering beyond what was possible within the structure of the National Academy of Sciences. That's a thriving academy and very important. And then in 1970, a third entity was established, academy-like entity was established under the charter called the Institute of Medicine. Why it was called that and not the National Academy of Medicine is beyond my pay grade. I have never understood why that happened. But in 2015, it was normalized and became the National Academy of Medicine. So we have three academies, all operating under the charter of the National Academy of Sciences, but the three operate in many respects independently in terms of electing their members and doing their own special business. We cooperate fully, however, in doing the business of advising the nation. Could you click the slides again then, Tom? So in 2015, the NRC was renamed for public consumption the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or sometimes the acronym NASEM is used. Sorry for that jumbled Venn diagram. I don't know how that happened. It doesn't show up that way on my slides. But so that just meant, that's meant to signify that it as a cooperative venture of the three academies, this entity originally called the NRC, now NASEM, works across all three academies with participation of all three academies under the leadership of a governing board that comprises the three presidents of the three academies and many members of the three academies. And it's that entity, the NASEM, that does the work of advising the nation. And with that, I want to say now that it's my pleasure to hand it off to the guy that has to oversee that, my good friend, Greg.
Thank you, John. And Tom, if I could have the next slide. So just launching off from where John ended, and thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, and Tom. So as John mentioned, we have the three academies and that oversee the work, and you see them in the org chart here. And I'm the chief program officer that oversees the work, the advisory work of the academies is done by 7 program divisions: behavioral and social sciences and education, earth and life studies. Earth and life studies, until 2 years ago, I was the head of the division on earth and life studies. Physical engineering and physical sciences, the Gulf Research Program, Health and Medicine Division, Policy and Global Affairs, and the Transportation Research Board. And as Michelle mentioned earlier, the GWIR and FDP are administered, are managed out of the Policy and Global Affairs Division. And also within the purview, we also have 2 other entities: our Office of Congressional and Governmental Affairs, that deals with our interface with Congress, and the Report Review Committee that plays, it's a committee of academy members, all 3 academies, as John mentioned, who play a critical role in ensuring the quality of all the reports that come out of the academies. A very independent report review process. Next, Tom. So just to reiterate some of the things that John mentioned earlier about who we are. We're a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides independent, trustworthy advice. And that goes back to the original charter from 1863, as John mentioned. We also have a role in facilitating solutions to complex challenges. And that's at the end of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about our strategic plan. But this added role of not only providing advice and then leaving it to others to figure out how to implement the advice. Increasingly through activities like roundtables and action collaboratives, we're playing a bigger role in facilitating solutions. And we do this by pulling together experts who bring their expertise, their practice, and their knowledge in science, engineering, and medicine to bear. And some of those are members, but most of the volunteers that work for the National Academies are not members of the Academies. Next. And so what we do, this is just an overview of, we're best known for our in-depth consensus studies. Many refer to these as the gold standard of independent, trustworthy advice on science and engineering issues. And these government agencies and foundations come to us when they have complex questions or challenges. And what we do is pull together the leading experts in those fields, the fields necessary to answer that question. They go out, collect information, deliberate, and produce a consensus report that summarizes their conclusions and advice to the nation and the world on the particular questions asked. And on a typical time frame, studies take 6 to 18 months, although we're doing more and more on the shorter end of that time frame, and I'll mention a few later. Some as short as a matter of weeks to months when necessary. And again, some of the key characteristics that they're peer reviewed by that report review committee, and they contain consensus findings, conclusions, and recommendations that the academies stand behind. In addition to consensus studies, we also do a lot of convenings. We organize workshops where we pull together experts to gather information and share their ideas. And they can be organized on shorter timelines, typically 2 to 6 months. And the products of workshops are proceedings of the workshops that just summarize the key discussions attributed to individuals, and which we differentiate from our consensus studies. There's no formal recommendations, but a clear sense of the community and the experts arise from such workshops. We also have a host of other kind of ongoing convening activities, roundtables like we're, but we also have underneath the division structure that I mentioned earlier, we also have boards and standing committees and forums and other kind of convening activities that, just like they pull together government leaders, the private sector, academics, to periodically address issues of common interest to whatever the subject matter of the group is. And they can convene two to 4 times a year. And they don't have formal written products unless they organize formal workshops, in which case they could have a proceedings or brief proceedings in brief. And then I mentioned before, one of the things that we've been doing more and more of, especially over the last 2 years in response to COVID, is to develop quick response mechanisms. We had early in the pandemic, the White House and the Department of Health and Human Services came to us and asked us to put together a standing committee on 21st century health threats. And that group produced very rapid, we created a new product, a rapid expert consultation, that they were able to pull together the scientific literature on questions and pull together a summary of that in the matter of days to weeks in the early days of the pandemic. Again, they don't formally represent the same deliberative consensus views of the gold standard consensus studies, but can turn around advice on much shorter timelines. So that's kind of what we do. Next, Tom. And what I'm going to do now is just kind of highlight a few reports, some dating back a number of years, that have really had a dramatic impact, documented impact on science and society. And so this is one. It was produced by the Institute of Medicine before it changed its name to Error Human. And you may be familiar with this, but one of the important conclusions of this committee was that as many of 98,000 people die a year due to medical errors that occur in hospitals. And it was that conclusion from the committee that the number of people, that such a large number of people die from medical errors, that which is larger than the number of people that die from motor vehicle accidents and breast cancer or AIDS. And so this report is widely recognized as being responsible for launching the modern patient safety movement. Next. Another report that many of you may be familiar with, I imagine some of you may be current members of our Action Collaborative on preventing sexual harassment in research institutions. But this is a groundbreaking report from 2018 that explores the influence of sexual harassment of women in academia and on the career advancement of women in the science, technical, and medical workforce. And again, since the release of that report in 2018, a couple of years ago, we launched an action collaborative that's similar to GWIR and a bit like FDP, where the member institutions, the universities, work together to ensure that the advice from this report is implemented within universities. Next. This is another example, a more recent report that had a very dramatic impact recently, and this is the report on Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. And this is a report from our Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education that reviews the research on the linkages between child poverty and child well-being, and analyze the effects of the poverty reducing effects of major assistance programs. And there's a quote here from Rosa DeLaura, the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, that cited this report as kind of breaking the logjam, the policy logjam, in terms of including a child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan that was passed in 2021. So a great example of the kind of impact and influence our reports can have. Next. And now I'm going to just mention a few areas, more recent reports that we've done in some key areas where we've seen a dramatic influence or a dramatic increase in the body of work here at the academies. So this is just a few examples of the many reports we've done and workshop proceedings that we've done that dealt with various elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, including a workshop on the impacts of racism and bias on Black people pursuing careers in science, engineering, and medicine, the trajectories of women of color in tech, the feasibility of wheelchair securement concepts for airline travel that was done by our Transportation Research Board, and a workshop on reducing inequalities with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals in the world, that's done by our Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education. Next. I mentioned before some of the work that we've done in response to the pandemic. And we've done a combination of consensus studies. The report on the left that was a very extremely rapid consensus study that looked at produced a framework for equitable allocation of the COVID-19 vaccine that was done in 2 months from start to finish, from the time it was requested by the Department of Health and Human Services to when we had a consensus report out advising, and the advice from this report was adopted by many states as they had to make tough choices in allocating the vaccine in the early days of the vaccine. And also several other examples of workshops reports that have been done looking at the impact of COVID on the careers of women in academic science, engineering, and medicine, and the impact of COVID on the future of Black communities in science, engineering, and medicine. We also, as part of our, we also launched at the request of the National Science Foundation, the Societal Experts Action Network, or SEAN, that co-opted the approach that I mentioned earlier of the Standing Committee on Emerging Infectious Diseases to produce very rapid, practical guidance, in this case targeted towards state and local decision makers on issues that interface between the social and behavioral and economic sciences and the COVID pandemic. Issues like how do you convince the public to be vaccinated and to wear masks, and so that has been so well received by NSF that they've re-upped it, and they're actually thinking about, the White House is thinking about a SEAN for climate as part of their climate strategy. And again, many webinars and workshops on COVID-19 over the past 2 years. Next. Climate and energy is another, we have an incredible body of work on issues related to climate change and energy. A few examples here, a report that came out last year from our Board on Energy Environmental Systems, working with their partners in other parts of the organization on what's needed to accelerate the decarbonization of the US energy system. The report in the middle that looked at both the governance and the research needs on geoengineering and possible strategies, preparing ourselves for the possibility that we may need to geoengineer the climate as a way to respond to climate. And another report that looked at the future of the electric grid, making the electric grid more resilient to climate change and other disasters. And finally, I'll just mention a new initiative. I'll come back to this at the end of my presentation, that we're calling Climate Crossroads. That will be a more proactive approach for the academies and a more holistic approach to dealing with the climate challenge. Next. And another group of reports, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that the academies have done in guiding the nation's science and technology enterprise, the so-called decadal surveys, including the decadal on astronomy and astrophysics, which came out last year, a project we did for the National Science Foundation on next generation Earth system science, which brought together, was a cross-divisional effort within the academies, and other projects on combating antimicrobial resistance, reducing dementia, and investing in transportation resilience, just as a few examples. Next. And finally, one of the 7 divisions I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation is the Gulf Research Program. It's the only division that is organized geographically rather than substantively, but more importantly, it's a different animal because it's funded. It has its own source of funding to carry out its activities. And it was set up at the request of the Justice Department out of the criminal settlement funds from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. So the Academies receives $500 million to set up a 30-year program for dealing with improving the safety of offshore oil and gas, improving the environmental and the health of Gulf communities. And so we have 5 boards that have been set up, and the Gulf Research Program is carrying out a whole host of activities, scholarships like the Gulf Scholars Program, community partnerships like the Enhancing Community Resilience or ENCORE program, and a variety of other activities that are designed to, again, improve offshore oil safety, as well as the health and the environment, the health of the environment and health of the Gulf communities. Next. And then finally, a few other notable programs and initiatives. One was last fall when Afghanistan fell, the staff in our Policy and Global Affairs Division reached out and provided support to a number of Afghani refugee scientists that had been supported through one of our programs, the PEER program with USAID. And we developed an effort to facilitate their escape from Afghanistan and their ultimate placement within the science academies of Rwanda. And that foundation, which we set up through that effort, has been used much more recently over the last few months to support Ukrainian refugee scientists who've been escaping in response to the Russian invasion. And that effort, we've raised over close to $4 million now in donations, working in partnership with the Polish Academy of Sciences to identify placements for refugee scientists, mostly females, who were escaping and placing them in research institutions in Poland for 3 to 6 months. So that's something we're actively doing through the Safe Passage Fund at the academies. And then 2 more examples of proactive work that the academies are doing. One is something we're calling the Infrastructure Investment Prioritization Initiative that looks to help state, federal agencies and federal agencies prioritize from the major infusion of infrastructure investment dollars that are being generated. And finally, the Climate Crossroads initiative, which is a proactive approach for the academies to mobilize all the expertise we have across all of our divisions to tackle in a proactive way and identify solutions to the climate challenge. Next. And then finally, I'll leave you with the Nrc Strategic Plan. And this was the first strategic plan for the NRC was finalized last year. And I won't go through all the details, but we have a vision, a mission, core values. And again, I apologize for the formatting. See the same issue that John mentioned before in reformatting the slides. But I'll just leave you with a couple notes about our strategic plan. It's the 2 goals of the, well, there's 3 goals for the plan. The first, challenging us to be much more proactive as an organization, to anticipate and prepare society for challenges rather than just waiting to be asked by federal agencies and others to tackle problems. 2, to try to expand our impact in the world by making activities more diverse and inclusive and using advanced communications. And then finally, the third is to strengthen all aspects of the NRC. And we're in the process of strengthening our governance process, being a number of initiatives to sustain and support our staff, and to deploy advanced technologies within our operations. So I'm going to stop there, and then John and I would be happy to answer questions that you might have. And again, thank you Michelle, for the opportunity to present here and talk with the members of the FDP.
Thank you so much, Greg, John, and Tom. I'm going to share with you some of the questions that are in the chat. There are a few, and some are directed to specific individuals and others for the group as a whole. Greg, actually, the first question is for you from Dick Sugman, who is as you know, our executive director for the FDP. And he's just interested in learning a little bit more on your comments about the NAS view of the FDP and its work.
You're muted, Greg.
Sorry. And I'll give John a chance to answer this too, but I think FDP is really an untapped, I don't think we've really tapped into the potential for FDP, for the kinds of synergies that are potential between what I described as the NRC, or the National Academies, and the FDP. You know, I did mention I've been on the Academy staff for 27 years, and I can honestly say, you know, I haven't been I didn't worked in the Division on Earth and Life Studies for most of that time, but there isn't a lot of appreciation for what FDP is within most of our staff. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and you know, some examples. You know, I mentioned the strategic plan, the direction to be much more proactive as an organization, and to be thinking about how we can work better to make sure that our advice is implemented to have greater impact. I think, you know, that would be a terrific synergy between FDP and our academies. If we can figure out a way to interface so that the members of FDP are more aware of the reports and the advice that that the NRC gives, and then work together to figure out creative ways to ensure that the advice is implemented, and vice versa. There are some other activities that you may not be aware of. Marcia McNutt, the president of the NAS, has recently launched SCORE IT, which she calls the Strategic Council on Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust. And that group is charged with doing a lot of, I think there's significant overlap with the kind of issues that SCORE IT is tackling, and many of the things that are within the remit of FDP. Just one more example before I turn it to John, and that's the issue of conflicts of interest. Last fall, we rolled out a revised and improved conflict of interest policies and procedures for the academies, and I noticed that you've got a working group on conflict of interest. So, and as far as I know, we had no interaction there as we were revising our policies, and now we're actually in discussions with AAMC about their convey system as a more systematic approach for collecting information about conflicts and disclosures. So I think there's an incredible potential for us to be working together more closely. So, John?
Yeah, well, I'll just echo that. I think my observation has been that relatively few of our colleagues in PGA or anywhere else in ASEM really understand what the FDP is and what it's been doing. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, I understand why that is. I mean, there's so much going on in the NASEM. This has not been prominent the way many other things have been. But I think it's also because what the people who really appreciate FDP are the people out in the academic research environment where the benefits of the work of FDP have been most felt, most obvious, and the folks in the NRC and the SCM, I think, don't feel it to the same extent. But it's interesting to note that I just had a very good conversation yesterday with Von Tarikian, the executive director of PGA, where, as you've heard already from us, the FDP resides. And I was talking to him about how we have a great opportunity now with a change in staffing of GWIR and FDP to really raise its profile. And he was very resonant with that idea. So I think, Greg, you and I and others who understand what this is doing, we need to help Vaughn make sure the profile is raised and there's better understanding of what FDP does. It's so valuable for the nation. That's the angle I gave to Vaughn. We're doing exactly what the Academy was created to do by helping to make this supportive research work better in every dimension.
Yeah, I very much appreciate both of your thoughtful responses there. And I think I would simply point out that with 255 member institutions and 10 federal agencies, you know, the FDP is a very extensive network now of obviously faculty members as well as administrators who are partners in many of the initiatives I think that the Academy is pursuing, and we're very grateful to learn more about that. We have a few more questions coming in, so I'll get through as many of them as I can in the next 10 minutes. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. I understand the value of maintaining independence of NASM from the government, but it seems that NASM's resulting dependence on funding from other entities, particularly those who request studies, raises questions around conflict of interest for itself. This question is really asking, how does NASM manage that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just to clarify, to start, we do receive most of our funding from federal agencies, so it's not just a question of you know, maintaining independence from non-federal. Both John and I, we don't get a direct appropriations, and we're not part of the government, but each project is funded by, you know, not all projects are funded by federal agencies, but most of them are. But to get to the question of independence, our procedures, we work very hard, and we're actually required under a special section of the Federal Advisory Committee Act to keep, we have firewalls between our projects and our sponsors, whoever they are, whether they're federal agencies or foundations, and in rare cases, the private sector. And so, you know, we do negotiate the terms of our projects with the sponsors, what the specific task questions are, and the funding, and we also are open to receiving recommendations for the experts to serve on our committees from our sponsors. But all deliberations are done in private. There's no federal involvement. We don't run drafts by sponsors. And again, we have very strict firewalls between the deliberative process and the development of draft recommendations and the report review process that I mentioned before. And it's not until a draft report has gone through all of those processes. And I should have mentioned, we also have a required public disclosure period where the proposed committees that serve on our committee are posted for 20-day public comment period, and as another check to be sure that we have the right balance and we're bringing the right experts to bear.
There's another question coming in again from an anonymous attendee. Have NASM reports analyzed the health and or productive future directions for higher education institutions? I suspect there are many such reports. I'd be interested in hearing your take on a couple that come to mind.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, as you say, there are a number of examples. We tend, I can't think of an example where we've actually reviewed an individual university program or university, but we are frequently asked to assess the health of a discipline. And a recent example of that, which I thought might be interesting, was the chemical engineering. And there was a famous report from 1988 that looked at the health of the chemical engineering discipline, and then provided a vision for the future of the discipline. And so 3 or 4 years ago, the sense was it was way overdue for an update. And so we put together a proposal, and we actually crowdsourced it. It was an unusual case where we got contributions from chemical engineering departments throughout the nation, who each chipped in $5,000–$10,000, and we also got some funding from NSF and Department of Energy and the American Chemical Society. So that's one example that comes to mind. So we tend to look at the health of a discipline or a field rather than specific institutions.
So I could add something here that the Committee on Science, Engineering, Medicine, and Public Policy, which we affectionately call COSAPUP, that committee, which is an unusual committee of the many in NASM, in that its membership is all members of the 3 academies. That committee is just now in the process of trying to formulate a plan to do a study of the future of research universities in the United States. It started with the notion that our public research universities are particularly in peril because of the declining public support for higher education. But it's going to be, as it evolves, it'll be comprehensive. I think it'll look at all the landscape of research universities. I'm sure the person who asked the question may have had something like that in mind, and that is being germinated as we speak.
Well, you may not be surprised to know that there were 2 different sessions yesterday on the challenges being faced in workforce continuity due to the Great Resignation, which I've changed into the 4 R's of retirement, renegotiation, which actually came out of a faculty steering committee conversation on this same topic, and remote working and so forth. I wonder to what extent now you'll be thinking about all of the shifts in the form of labor and the way in which people may be considering new horizons on a different timetable than we might have anticipated in a past workforce in the scientific realm. I wonder what your thoughts about that are in terms of this report.
Yeah, I know this is an issue that's front of mind here at the National Academies as well. We're dealing with many challenges related to recruiting and retaining our staff. So I'm not aware of a study that's underway currently that's dealing with that issue, but if there is, I'm very interested in it myself, because we have about over 100 positions that we're recruiting for right now.
Oh my!
Within the academies.
Yeah.
Out of our staff of about 1,000.
Yeah. I was going to just say something along the same lines. I don't think there's any entity that isn't suffering from this. And in the DC area, of course, in addition to all the other things that you mentioned with your 4 R's, there are a lot of people who just don't like to deal with the commute that they have to do every day. And so, I mean, it's quite discouraging to see the hurdles that people feel they have to go through, and to see that leads people to feel that they should be doing something else. This work is so important. We want to see the good people we have keep doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's an interesting question just on the NAS efforts to enhance diversity in the membership. I assume that means members of the Academy, but I think there's a broader diversity, equity, inclusion question in there. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, John, do you want to start with the, with the NAS?
I'll take that to start with. Yeah, this has been a very big matter for the council and in fact, the whole National Academy of Sciences. I can speak best about NAS. I'm sure it's also true in the other two academies, but I'm not authoritative on their efforts. But in the NAS, for the last several years, there's been a very big effort to diversify the membership through a more inclusive and diverse election process. And it's working very well. I mean, we have had in the last 3 or 4 years record numbers of women and persons of color, and even to some extent, people who live in what we call the flyover zone, that is the part of the country that isn't on the coast, because an astonishing proportion of our members come from the two coasts, and that simply doesn't reflect the true pattern of where excellence in science, engineering, and technology exists in this country. So we have a very good effort underway, and it's working. I mean, a year ago, I guess it was 2 years ago, the membership elected 49% women. Now there's never been anything even imagined like that before. And we also that same year elected more African American members than any other time in the history of the Academy. So from that point of view, from the point of view of diversifying the membership, I think we're on a very good pathway. And I think the means that are being used to incentivize that are effective and will continue. I also believe, and Greg can comment on this, that the efforts to diversify the participation in studies is also very serious. We have our first equity, inclusion, and diversity officer in the NICM, and I'm sure Greg can comment about that. So we're taking all of this, I think, as seriously as any institution I know. Greg, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a very visible sign of how serious is that we just hired our first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Laura Castillo-Page. She started last summer, and she reports directly to the 3 presidents, and also a new director of staff, a workforce diversity and inclusion as well. Again, a first for us. So we recognize we have a long way to go. We are focusing on diversifying the membership of our committees, the volunteers who serve on our committees. We have a long way to go to actually represent the diversity of our population. But that's a common issue with scientific and engineering organizations writ large. But we're working hard and not only diversifying the membership of our activities, but also thinking about how we can ensure that issues of DE&I are considered by more of our committees. And right now we have a big study going on advancing anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM organizations. You may be familiar with that. But also the studies, I mentioned the decadal survey of Astro 2020. For the first time, that decadal survey had a special panel that was focused on the societal impacts and issues of DE&I that were unique to the astrophysics and astronomy community. So, and we're seeing that so both focused studies and workshops on issues of DE&I and making issues of DE&I an important element of those studies that you might not initially expect them to be a part of the study.
Thank you so much for that comment. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation today. This has been a very eye-opening session, and I hope we'll continue to find ways to connect not only in the FDP meetings, but in other Academy activities as well, not only with GWIR, but other programs. John, Tom, Greg, thank you so much. I know we have a lot of people jumping off, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I really appreciate your willingness to join us for this afternoon session. And we stand adjourned with this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye.